Hello, everyone. Welcome. So excited to have you. I'm Scott, and I am the creator of Understand Your Accent. It's an interpersonal communication company. Some people call it an accent reduction company. I don't really like calling it that. I'm not really reducing accent. I'm really more of an accent or a spoken English clarity coach, I guess is the best way you could put that. I have my undergraduate degree in speech language pathology, and I do have a master's in business administration. So I'm a business guy and a speech guy all at the same time. And I did not go into speech pathology. As a matter of fact, after I graduated, I was planning on going to graduate school for speech language pathology to become a speech pathologist. But this was back in the 90s. I needed to go full time. Once I graduated, I couldn't really afford to go to school full time. I needed to work. So I made a huge move. I moved out to Boston, Massachusetts, and started working in the mutual fund industry. And as I did that, I found out the company that hired me would pay for my MBA, and they actually paid for it up front, which was nice. So that's why I got my MBA. And then I started learning financial services. And about 5 years into the operations of mutual funds, I realized I wanted something a little bit more. And so I did a lot of soul searching and did a lot of things. And I figured out, you know what, I'll become a corporate trainer. And that's what I did. I trained. I was in mutual fund services training for a decade. And through that time, not only did I teach new employees and I taught them about what a mutual fund is, how to answer phones, how to process different transactions, but I also got into the organizational side of things. So I did a lot of communications training, leadership training, risk management training. So I did a lot of different things, which I loved. And during that time, what I noticed is as our company started to outsource some of our employment, and we had people coming in from different countries, and I was training them, I definitely noticed that even though these folks had a good command on English, it was still very hard to understand their speech, and sometimes hard for them to understand our speech. So that got really going to more of a computer-based style. And I didn't want to become what's the word? Just a designer of computer training. I really like teaching people and working with people, and I really like that. And if I could do that, I wanted to do something else. So I talked to a friend, and I was able to move over into IT and to leverage my communication skills over there, where I became a business analyst. And then I also, from there, I became very integrated within what's called IT service management or ITSM, and became a problem manager there and did that for many years. And then from there, I went to a different company where I actually owned the incident and problem management processes and moved on. And as I moved through IT, I started working with more and more people globally. And again, I worked with a lot of people who spoke English either as a primary language or as a foreign language, but they were very, very knowledgeable. They had a wonderful vocabulary. They had a great grasp on grammar and syntax. If you read what they wrote, you might not even know that they were offshore. But as soon as they spoke, we knew that they had an accent, but more importantly, we couldn't necessarily understand what they're saying. And so that kind of led me to really get involved in trying to understand the nature of understandability. And I've spent many, many years doing so. And the result of that is my company understand your accent? So where do we get started? There's just so much here that we can talk about. But if we start in the beginning and we just talk about how we learn language, really almost any language, right? But especially as we're learning a second or a foreign language, we're going to start with the sounds that we already know how to make, that we already use within our language, okay? And then as we learn this language, maybe we have to learn new sounds, which happens all the time, which is fine. But don't forget that we are still using, if we're older at least, we're still using the filter of our initial language. And so as we learn this new language, we learn vocabulary, and I think of vocabulary, the words, as really the bricks in communication. Vocabulary is where the meaning of ideas start, right, in these bricks. Then, of course, we have syntax and grammar, and these help us also understand the meaning of these bricks, and it tells us how to actually order and stack the bricks as we do so. And I think that's very important for us to understand. But then what happens, and quite honestly, in most language teaching situations, that's kind of where we stop. So we go from learning our words, our syntax, our vocabulary, and maybe we even get to pronunciation a little bit. Maybe we even learn how to pronounce things a little bit, which is great. And that's super important. But what we're missing is the fact that if we look at the model here, as we try to decode what someone is saying in spoken language, and here specifically in spoken English, we start from the outside in. And so on the outside, which we're not necessarily taught, we just use what we've already used in our native language, our rhythm, the timing with our rhythm, the stress, all these things are related, as well as intonation. Those things that live on this outer ring, those actually are what I call gatekeepers to the words. We can't necessarily understand the words being said unless we understand the rhythm and the intonation. And so that's why I say, even though we learn from the inside out, we actually decode. Hello and welcome. We actually decode from the outside in. So we need to have rhythm and intonation that is aligned with what we're used to hearing in order to recognize the words and then how the words are structured within there. And so that's what we mean by the inside out, outside in. I mentioned that I'm a trainer by heart. I was a trainer for a decade. And one of the greatest lessons that I was given was when I first started. I'd maybe been a trainer for about 6 months, and my new manager sent me to a training, and it was a train the trainer. So learning how to be a professional trainer. And when I started, it was amazing because my eyes were really opened to what training meant. And this particular company that did the training had a model where they talked about what training actually was. And I have used it ever since and have really lived by it. So their model is that training is 1/3 presentation of information. And typically, when most people are talking about training, they're actually just talking about this piece, the information, the presentation of the information. But what I learned in the way that I do it is that that's 1/3 of training. So we have to present the information. But training really is about developing skill. So the second third of training is the practice or the application of this information that was just presented. So obviously we have to practice, right? So that's really, really important. But here's the thing. Most of us have been taught that practice makes perfect. And many, many years ago, I think it was Tony Robbins, I learned from him, and I didn't even come from him, but this is where I first heard it from, is he said, practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect. And that leads us to the third part of our training module. So remember, the first third is information presentation. Second third is the application or practice of the information. And then the final piece is actually feedback on your practice. The feedback is critical because we need to have that good feedback or that timely and accurate feedback. Feedback is really nothing more than performance information, but we need that, and that feeds back into our practice, right? So now we have this little feedback loop between our application and our feedback, and now we can practice perfectly. And that's what Understand Your Accent, the company that I created, that's what we do. Because when we start talking about understandability with people with learning English, and they have, I call them global English speakers because they have a different a different native language they've learned. They have underlying differences in their sounds as well as their rhythm and their intonation. And again, depending on who your audience is, and so much of being able to listen and understand somebody's spoken message, it's so subjective and it's so individualized. And that's why when I'm talking about being readily understood, I'm talking really specifically right now about being readily understood by Americans. And the reason why is because Americans on this outside in model, we are relying on familiar rhythm and pitch patterns to be able to decipher this inner layer, which are the words, the syntax, and the grammar. So that's critical. And so what I do within Understand Your Accent is, because of the fact that I was an analyst in IT for many years, I like to be very, very precise. And given my background with having a bachelor's degree in communication disorders with a concentration in speech language pathology, I do understand phonetics. I do understand speech science, and I am familiar with many of the tools. One of those, which it's an online speech analysis tool called Pratt. It was developed by two professors from the Netherlands, and it's heavily used in speech science and speech language pathology. And so what I've done is I've looked very closely at the differences between rhythm between native English speakers and then those that come from other native languages. So I work with these folks, and what I do is I actually have them say certain sentences so that we can get what's called a rhythm profile. And what I do is I run this person's voice sample through the program to find out what is called the onset times. So how long are the different syllables within a sentence? And we look at these onset times between the person who I am analyzing and then native English speakers. And depending on what they want to do, some people want to sound like me, so we'll compare theirs with mine specifically. But I also do have a composite profile of a number of different native English speakers that we can work with as well. And then what we do is, using an algorithm, we take the speech and we can turn it into either dots something very short, or dashes, something longer. This is where I come up with, this is why I talk about Morse code English. Some of you might be familiar with what Morse code is. It was developed in the late 1800s, and it was a combination of dots and dashes where people could communicate without having to speak. So they could communicate with either flashing lights or with maybe taps. It was used a lot when the telegraph first came through. But I mean, obviously now with the maturity of all of the communication devices that we have now, Morse code has kind of gone antique or maybe extinct, but it's still around. And the reason why I like to share it is because if you understand what Morse code is, it's a combination of dots and dashes. So S is short, 3 short dots. O is 3 long dashes, and then S, 3 short dots. That's probably one of the most famous Morse code. So if you understand that rhythm there, you'll understand the message, right? I'm in trouble. I need help. In English, at least in American English, are very much what's called a stress-timed language. So we actually, in order for us to understand what's being said, we need dots and dashes or short and long sounds for us to be able to differentiate what the word is. And this can be challenging because many people who learn English actually have a native language which uses what's called a syllable timed language. So each syllable is roughly the same length and the same stress. And so when we have somebody who is learning English whose native language is syllable timed, what can happen is we have somebody taking English and taking this syllable timed rhythm into English. And I do want to point out that there are what we call many world Englishes now, where English is one of the official languages in certain areas. India is one, Philippines, Nigeria. And so we have these languages, or we have these Englishes that are recognized as actual Englishes, where they do have different rhythms. And these rhythms are based on false sense of security, where we have people that have been studying English. Their country has English as an official language, so they've been studying it for years. But if they haven't necessarily spoken it with native English speakers, or I should say American native English speakers, where we're used to a very specific cadence, a very specific rhythm and tone, what can happen is we won't recognize the words. And I'll give you a couple examples here. I used to hear this all the time working in IT. So we have the word capacity, the ability to hold something, right? I think the hold something, the volume of something is an okay definition. So the capacity. But what I often would hear is somebody saying capacity. So the capacity is, well, when I first hear that, I don't think of capacity. I think of a large town named Kappa, okay, Kappa City. Eventually, I'll get caught up, but that can be a challenge. Same with velocity, right? Velocity, Velocity, the city named Velo. I can get there, but it takes a little while. And that actually brings me to another key piece of what I do and understand your accent. So, up to now, navigating understandability can be kind of tricky. So what does it mean to be understood, right? So what I've done is using the applied linguistics principles of accent, intelligibility, and comprehensibility. I've actually taken the second two concepts and put those together to create what I call understandability. And this is interesting because most of the times when we start talking about communicating globally with people in English, which is an amazing thing, right? English is such a powerful language because it's become what's called a lingua franca. People use it as a bridge across the world. But we have to be careful here because what happens is, in some cases where it's a lingua franca, it's appropriate to have an accent that the learners need to get used to and need to put effort into understanding what you're saying. But sometimes, if you're an IT company based somewhere else in the world and you want to do business in North America, then it's actually appropriate to be able to speak in such a way that the Americans or North American English speakers can readily decode what you're saying, essentially. So accent is merely a difference in the sounds that you make, whether it's at the phoneme level, so the actual sounds, like ah, eh, e, those types of things. The trilled R that I can't do, the regular R, that Americans use. Americans use those, others don't. That's part of it, but it goes beyond that. It's also differences in rhythm, velocity versus velocity, um, pitch. If I go up and down, that can also really change how we're able to perceive it if our intonation patterns or profiles and what we expect coming in are different than what we expect. So, and that's what I teach here is learning a few things. So learning how to speak in such a way, if you so choose, that you're more readily decodable by Americans. What I also teach is how Americans can be more open to learning and understanding world English speakers as well. So when it comes to intelligibility, intelligibility is how much of the message, or really how many words are being recognized and understood in spoken English. That's intelligibility. Is my message getting across? The way that we actually can measure intelligibility, sometimes it's measured by answering questions, but some people have doubts about that. But another way is to actually do a transcription. So if somebody is trying to say something and somebody else is listening to them and transcribes it, we look at the difference between what the person was trying to say and what the person who was listening and transcribing what they heard, right? And we can look at the difference, and then from there we can actually rate intelligibility. The other key part or the key concept of applied linguistics is comprehensibility. So comprehensibility is how hard do we have to work to understand the meaning? And that's different from whether or not we can actually get the words, we can get the meaning. How hard do we have to work? Because to be honest with you, especially when I worked in IT, I worked with many, many people that had a very, very good grasp of English, and I could understand them. But many times I was exhausted after a meeting because I had to work so hard to understand them. So, in other words, their intelligibility was high, but their comprehensibility was low because I had to work so hard to understand them. Because that's the thing about comprehensibility. It's an inverse relationship to how hard somebody has to work. So if you don't work hard to understand, that's high comprehensibility. If you have to work very hard, that's low comprehensibility. So what I've done is I've made understandability measurable by creating a graph where the x-axis is intelligibility and the y-axis is comprehensibility. And so that we can actually measure now people's understandability. Here's the limits to this assessment, by the way. It is done by one person, and that one person has their own experiences or no experience with this particular accent. So again, listening and understandability is very much on the listener, not just the speaker, but on the listener. And it's very subjective, right? So the way that we actually measure our understandability is with the intelligibility piece. We have people give us a speech sample. Actually, we have them give a couple speech samples. And then I have a network of native English speakers that will listen to the samples and transcribe them. And then those transcriptions are given to someone else that receives, they know what the person was trying to say, and they look at the transcription to see what was actually said. Excuse me. And then they actually rate. So the more words that were trying to be said that were transcribed, the higher the intelligibility. If there aren't a lot, the lower the intelligibility. So that's the one piece of it. The other piece is that the raters, when they actually receive the samples and they're transcribing, they also rate on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 how hard it was to understand, or how hard they had to work to understand what was being said. So this self-rating piece, that first, the intelligibility piece, is somewhat objective, although based on subjective things such as how familiar they are with an accent, how good is their hearing. There are a lot of things that play into it. But assuming that they're all set with all of those, and we're just looking at, can they transcribe the words, fairly objective. But the comprehensibility piece, how hard did I have to work to understand? That's completely subjective. But that is our y-axis. So what happens is when they give their Likert scale and their down below their transcriptions over to the people that actually put together the assessment, what happens is we actually create what's called an understandability score. Because within this understandability matrix, with the intelligibility as the x-axis, the comprehensibility as the y-axis, now we can actually plot where they are. And there's a natural formation of quadrants within the understandability matrix. I'm not going to go into this right now. I think if I can, what I'll do is I will share a link to a video that I created. It's not my voice. I hired a professional voiceover artist, but it is my script. I did create all of the animation. Everything is mine except for my voiceover guy's voice. But I will maybe put that in as well. I know that there is already a link to the first part of the this video that talks about being not readily understood. And the reason why you're not readily understood is because you were never taught the spoken rules of English, to be honest with you. Well, that's my 30 minutes today. I appreciate anybody and everybody who just popped in. And for those of you that are watching the recording, welcome. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to put something in the comments about what you enjoyed the most, or any thing that you want me to talk about next time. Have a great day.